Hello, and welcome to the Nature Outlook Live webcast. Our topic today is Rising Waters Resilient Future, Rethinking the Global Flood Crisis. My name is Herb Brody, and I'm the editor at Nature in charge of our Outlook supplement. Outlooks explore important scientific issues from a variety of angles and at greater length than is possible within the pages of the weekly magazine. And we edit these stories to be accessible to an audience of non-specialists. Today's webcast grew out of an outlook on water, which is scheduled to be posted on nature.com next week. Everyone who has registered for this webcast will be emailed a link to the outlook when it goes live, so keep an eye on your inbox. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to thank the Future Investment Initiative Institute for their financial support for both the Outlook on Water and for this event. And I should add that the editors of Nature retain sole responsibility for the content of this outlook and for today's presentations. It's now my privilege to welcome our distinguished panel. Paul Bates is a professor of hydrology at the University of Bristol in the UK, where he specializes in the science of flooding. Rebecca Hale is a senior scientist at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland. Much of her research is focused on the historical development of urban stormwater and flood management. June Rentschler is a senior economist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., working at the intersection of climate change and sustainable resilient development. And the moderator for this webcast will be Fabio Pulizzi, the chief editor of the journal Nature Water. After these presentations, we should have ample time for discussion, so I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. Panelists will then address as many of them as they can. Over to you, Fabio.
Thank you very much, Herb, and thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, June, for being panelists today. Thanks for everybody who's attending. So today we're talking about floods. So floods are not something new, really, are they? We've had them always, but they are intensifying. At least this is what we know from prediction and data and predictions from climate change and their effect on extreme weather events. We've also seen them more in the news. If you think about the tragic events, just to name a few this year in Italy, in Libya, in New York City, and these are just examples that I take from what I personally receive in the news where I live in the United Kingdom. So we need to improve our resilience to flood. But how do we do that? So first of all, what are the factors that affect the impact of floods? Is it just the climate, or is it also economic development? Is it other factors? And also, we are kind of familiar with the effects in the short term. Unfortunately, tragically, very often is the loss of lives even. But what happens in the long term? What happens, for example, to the quality of the water? So, and eventually also, what does it mean to build resilience? Is it about trying to predict when the flood is coming and where is it going, and therefore trying to avoid it that way? Or is it a question of making the infrastructure stronger in a way to protect us, or even just planning strategically where we're going to develop our cities, our homes, and the infrastructure so that we avoid the damages of floods? Well, it's a lot of questions, of course, lots of questions to answer, and for that we have gathered a panel, this panel that gathers that combines different expertises, as Herb has already mentioned. Paul is, among other things, my introduction is very superficial because all three panelists do a lot of things, but Paul is expert, particularly in climate and flood modeling. Rebecca is, among other things, work on stormwater management, and June looks at climate and sustainability primarily from an economics perspective. So I'm now going to ask all of them to give a short introduction of their work. And after that, we're going to continue with a panel discussion. As Herb has already mentioned, I believe, if you have any questions, just put them in the question box, and we'll try to answer what we can in this hour. And sorry in advance if we're not able to answer them all. So I'll just ask Paul now to give a presentation of his work. Thank you very much, Paul, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Fabio, and thank you to both you and Herb for the invitation, and hello to everyone this afternoon. So as Herb says, I'm primarily a physical scientist, although in flood that means very little. Floods are clearly a socioeconomic and engineering and a scientific problem, and sometimes even a medical problem as well. But I'm going to stick to talking about the physical hazard and talk a little bit about what global flood risk and the climate change and what the models can tell us. So if we think about global flood modeling, actually, this is a rapidly emerging paradigm. So global flood models emerged maybe in the early 2010s. So this is something that can predict areas at risk of inundation across the whole terrestrial land surface. And even in my group, they've advanced really quite rapidly over the last 8 years. On this slide, I've got 3 images from version 1, version 2, and version 3 of our global flood model. And you can see, going from top to bottom, the improvement in fidelity and hopefully accuracy in these models. So we go from a 1 kilometer code in 2015 to a 90-meter resolution model in 2020, and now a 30-meter resolution model released earlier this year. And we've got a paper in review in Water Resources Research on this. So these models can now simulate pluvial, fluvial, and coastal floods, and they can look at both present day and future climate hazards with uncertainty. So let's have a look at what these things might tell us about flood risk now and into the future. And here are the projections from our most recent global flood model that's in review at the reference on the screen. And this looks at the change in global flood hazard under both low and high climate scenarios, so SSP1 and SSP5. And in the top, you see the total flood hazard change from 2020 through to 2100. And in the bottom little 3 panels, you can see the components of that in terms of coastal, pluvial, and fluvial flood risk. So if we look at the top panel, we can see a number of features. First of those is that even under present day conditions, there's quite a lot of climatological uncertainty over what current flood hazard is. Probably plus or minus 10% in our estimates of global flood hazard, just on the basis of uncertainty over the current climate. And that grows as we move into the future. And we've taken here ensembles of global climate models to give the spread in shaded areas. But you can see that even on the median projections, it's not until 2020, about 2070, that we would be able to conclusively determine we were on the SSP5 pathway as opposed to SSP1. And it's not until 2100 or thereabouts that we'd be able to conclusively determine that we were on SSP1 and not on SSP5. So the point I'm making here is that although flood hazards increase into the future, and we can now model the mix of those hazards, climatological uncertainty is already large and will remain large into the future in our projections. And therefore, when we take decisions, we're having to take decisions under uncertainty. And that's a very different paradigm from using a deterministic model. We can also say something now about the losses that might occur. And this is a study over the UK we published earlier this year, where we look at what's known as the loss exceedance curve for flood. So this is the return period at which particular total annual flood loss in the UK is exceeded. And you can see an x-axis going from 1 year to 100 years, and a y-axis in billions of Great British pounds. And I've plotted here 3 different loss exceedance curves for different amounts of warming above pre-industrial. 0.6 of a degree, which is about where we were in 1990, 1.1 degree, which is about where we are now, and then 1.8 degree, which is probably a best case scenario if all the COP26 and net zero pledges are implemented. And then 2 further lines, 2.5 degrees and 3.3. And these are if the COP26 pledges and other commitments are missed and the climate turns out to be more sensitive than we currently thought. And the point about this slide is that actually, if we manage emissions, the increase in flood risk that we've seen so far and will see into the future is going to be reasonably manageable in the UK. But scenario matters. If we don't meet the Paris Agreement targets. And this is particularly apposite given COP28 is going on at the moment. Then actually flood losses in the UK could be, for the 1 in 100-year event, anything up to nearly 40% higher than they are in the present day. So we have some choices. We can now know a lot more about the physical hazard, and flood is such a local problem that we have to have this high spatial resolution across the whole planet in order to come up with good predictions. But now we can do these climate change projections for both hazard and loss with uncertainty and interrogate those in order to formulate better policy. Fabio, that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. And so we'll have questions at the end, of course, but so I'll just pass the word to Rebecca. Please, Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi. I don't appear to have slide controls quite yet. Ah, there we do. Oh, there we go. All right. So hi, I'm Rebecca Hale, and I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training. And so, of course, I like to make everything really complicated. And so I really do a lot of place-based work. And so what I'm going to share today is kind of how I've been thinking about flooding and thinking about, especially within cities. And most of my work has been within the United States. And so really thinking about how development legacies, kind of how we've developed cities through time, how that shapes the risk landscape that we have today within cities in terms of flooding, and also future pathways for how we might move forward in the future. And so our urban landscapes really reflect the past in terms of how we've developed wastewater infrastructure. So this is a historic image of people putting in combined sewer pipes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in terms of how we've developed flood infrastructure. So this is a kind of a multi-use flood infrastructure that was put in Scottsdale, Arizona. And then also kind of social and economic legacies as well. So in the United States, housing discrimination through redlining, which is, was ended in the 1960s, but still has persistent ecological and certainly social impacts. And so all of that really lays the groundwork for how our cities function hydrologically and otherwise. And how we've managed through cities really changes through time. And it reflects changing ideas about what we want our cities to do, the problems that we're trying to address, and the kind of co-benefits that we want to get. So in the 1960s, in terms of stormwater management, in the 1960s, we went from management that was really solely focused on the quantity of water. And now we've seen this expansion of kind of goals that people have for stormwater management. And we see this in all different types of management in cities. So thinking not just about quantity, which we're still thinking about, but also can you develop systems that also provide opportunities for recreation, that integrate with other elements of urban design, that address water quality, that might provide ecosystem benefits, that might allow you to reuse stormwater. And so that kind of shifting through time creates a spatial and temporal template on which climate change acts and non-climate change, just our current system. So in terms of urban hydrology, we see that this is work from my dissertation now many years ago, showing that runoff during storm events is much higher from watersheds that are drained with traditional gray infrastructure such as pipes, and we see decreases as you increase the amount of retentive infrastructure across the landscape. And so these changing paradigms can really change the impact of storms on the landscape. The legacies we see on the landscape can also influence water quality. So this is a photograph of a sanitary sewer overflowing onto a street during a rain event in Baltimore, Maryland. So we see a lot of intersections between wastewater systems and flooding and stormwater systems, especially in aging cities that might have combined sewer systems. But even in Baltimore, which has a separate sanitary sewer system, we see a lot of intersections between these systems that can really influence water quality, and that can have human health impacts as well as ecosystem impacts. And then, of course, underpinning all of this, is kind of who's there, who's living where, what are the equity and environmental justice implications of these impacts. So who's being impacted by water quality impacts, by flooding, and what is their capacity to respond to that? Where are more vulnerable people located, and how do we increase resilience of the human population within cities? So as we think about adaptation, we have to really avoid, I think there's a real danger of perpetuating inequalities in the way that we do this. So this is another example of some data from Baltimore, work I did with an undergraduate this past summer. And so this is showing the density of best management practices. And these are things like stormwater retention ponds that are designed to reduce nutrient inputs and water inputs into the stormwater system. And we see a really strong correlation between the use of best management practices, so different hits of green infrastructure, with household income. So we're putting more investment into places that already have more wealth. And you see this at all different scales, I think, across the world. And then more alarmingly, it's good and bad. So on the size of these dots is showing an indicator of wastewater in these systems. And so what we see is that the best management practices are actually working in terms of providing cleaner water, but they're not distributed equitably. So basically, this is showing us that if you have lower income, you're more likely to have basically poop in your water, and you're less likely to have these kind of investments that might improve that. But on the flip side, I think there's also so many opportunities as we adapt to climate change and increasing flooding to really try to improve this entire holistic system that we have in these cities. So we have opportunities to rebuild trust with communities by involving them in the planning for flood resilience, and to kind of couple the increase in physical resilience to increases in social resilience to climate change and all the other challenges that we're facing today. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And John, hopefully you'll get slide control pretty quickly.
Thank you, Fabio. Great, this seems to be working. So last in this row of presentations, I want to talk to you a little bit about how local development patterns are crucial in driving flood risk, and by extension also that means that the solutions are local. So in my job at the World Bank, I work predominantly with client governments in low and middle income countries. And what often distinguishes those countries from high income industrialized countries is, first of all, they are at the very forefront of climate change impacts. So that means including the rising frequency of extreme flood events, but also the rapid rate of change that we're seeing in many low and middle income countries. So high economic and demographic growth, rapid rates of urbanization and infrastructure development, and all of that is interacting to yield to give us the kind of flood exposure that we're seeing today. So if we look at a 2020 snapshot of our collective exposure globally to flood hazards, what we see is virtually no country is safe. So this is in each subnational region, the share of population living in flood zones. But flood exposure is really disproportionate for low and middle income countries, and then for the poorest communities within countries. When we think about climate change and how the flood hazards are intensifying, we want to be thinking about where the journey is headed in terms, or the trajectory is headed in terms of, are we managing to adapt to this hazard? So climate change adaptation would mean we're improving our preparedness for disasters, we're reducing our vulnerabilities, but also we're reducing our exposure to the hazards in the first place. So at what rate are we managing to actually do that? And that's kind of a trick question. Since 1985, the world's settlements have grown at about 85%. So that's the expansion of the spatial footprint of where humans live. And in the same time period, settlements in high-risk flood zones have increased at over 120%. So in other words, high-risk growth is outpacing safe growth. Over time, a larger and larger share of human settlements are located in flood zones. So that's really the opposite of adapting our exposure to flood hazards. I want to show you a little bit from our work what this global trend looks like at the local level. This is an image from Da Nang in central Vietnam, coastal Vietnam, from 2002. Vietnam is really at the forefront of climate change in many aspects, facing severe storm surges, floods, cyclones, and so on. But also coastal Vietnam is an extraordinary success story in terms of economic development and poverty reduction. So since the 1980s, what we've really seen is rapid economic growth in these coastal regions, a lot of migration from the periphery into these economic hubs on the coast, and with that came urbanization and a lot of spatial development. That also means there's increasing land scarcity. So safe and productive land is increasingly occupied, and what that means is that land that was previously avoided is now starting to be developed. So that means new development and settlements in river basins, in floodplains, in erosion-prone coastlines, and so on. And this pattern is not unique to Da Nang. If we look at the whole country, safe growth, the expansion of safe settlements has been about 170% since 1985. But if we look at high-risk settlements, they have grown at almost 300% in the same time period. So again, that means over time, increasing share of settlements in Vietnam are exposed or are located in flood zones. And again, this story is not unique to Vietnam either. If we look at Haiti, we see informal settlements being built up literally in river basins. We see wetlands in the outskirts of Lagos in Nigeria being built up, urbanized what used to be, or what still are very flood-prone areas because of land scarcity in the main city. In Tajikistan, we see new neighborhoods being built literally in what used to be the river bed just 10 years ago. This trend is really, this global trend is really driven to a large extent by middle-income countries, which have seen rapid urbanization, spatial expansion, and economic growth over the last 30 years. So this is really where risky growth is outpacing safe growth, often by very large margins. The trend actually reverses when you look at very high-income countries or very low-income countries. In the high-income countries, a lot of that economic growth, spatial expansion of cities has happened before the 80s. So there often the risk is already built into our urban forms. In low-income countries, that trajectory is still to come. So there's an opportunity here, or perhaps an opportunity really for low-income countries to avoid the kind of high-risk growth pattern that we see in today's middle-income countries as they continue that economic growth and think about how to plan spatial and urban expansion in the future. I want to finish off with this. I hope you can see this properly. I want to finish off with this drone image that was shot by local partners of ours in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, showing a flood in the middle of the city, because to me it really captures how there's no simple solution. The drivers of flood risk are very complex and cover many different sectors, as we've already heard from the other panelists. First of all, of course, there's the climate. It's changing, often intensifying in many of these locations. There's the quality of infrastructure and protection systems, which is often subpar in many of the countries that I work in. There are information barriers and behavioral biases in terms of how we access flood information, how we process it and integrate it into our decision-making. There are institutional factors, whether spatial planning and zoning regulations are actually helping us to avoid the riskiest, settling in the riskiest areas in the first place. There are also economic factors, because sometimes settling in risky areas can be a rational choice if a household decides it's worth the risk for the economic opportunities that they get in return. And then we've already heard about the social aspects, which are particularly intense, especially in the countries where I often work in, because flood risk tends to be priced into land values, which means that especially low-income, marginalized households often have no other choice than to settle in cheap, risky land, which then reinforces inequality and poverty. So I want to stop there. Hopefully that's enough food for thought for the discussion. Back to you, Fabio. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks. Yes, it is. I can tell you that much. There's a lot of information that I'm hoping that we can explore even more. But I'd like to kickstart briefly the discussion with something that might seem a trivial question with an obvious answer, or maybe not. And it is something in one of my fixations that we hear about resilience a lot, right? And you talked about it already, all three of you in many ways. But what do we actually mean by resilience? How do we define it? There are different perspectives in which we can define it. And maybe Paul, you can start by giving your view on this.
Well, I mean, classically, resilience is defined as the ability to build back, or sometimes even build back better. But you have to think what you're building back. I mean, if we just reinstate the infrastructure that was at risk, then we're just recycling through the same problem. And typically with insurance contracts, that can be what happens. So some of our main policy tools, insurance for delivering resilience, are sometimes not ideal. And I think if we think about resilience in different aspects, do we think about economic resilience? Do we think about just resilience to physical hazard? Or do we think about social and mental resilience? And we also know that even if we fix the physical problems, communities suffer enormously from health and mental health issues post-extreme events or post-disasters. So actually, what we're building resilience to needs to be thought through rather carefully. And I'm sure Rebecca and Jörn have probably more to say on those specific issues.
Yeah, I think when we think about resilience, I always think of resilience of what to what, right? So what elements do we want to be resilient? And what I think is most maybe illuminating when thinking about flooding and how we adapt to a changing environment is what are the systems that are resilient that we actually don't want to keep. So there's lots of things that are hard to change in cities. Like some infrastructure systems are really baked in, some kind of policy elements are baked in, a lot of these kind of structural, economic, and social problems are kind of baked in. And so how do you disrupt some of those systems? And I think thinking about that while thinking about what are the systems that we want to maintain resilience or increase the resilience of, like social cohesion, like strong economic systems, how do we adapt in a way that can kind of disrupt those things that are challenging to kind of that could be resilient to our efforts, and while using that to build the resilient systems that the things that we want to keep.
John, do you have a?
I mean, maybe I'll just add perhaps another angle. So I showed this last picture in my presentation from Dar es Salaam, where we also conducted a survey of households affected by floods. And I think it's also nice to think about resilience from really the individual affected person's perspective. And that means, is that household or that person able to prepare properly for floods, receive warning? Can they cope when the flood hits? Where do they go, for instance? Where do they evacuate to? Can they maintain food, education services, and so on, access to health services? After the flood, how do they recover? How do they rebuild? How do they regain access to their jobs, to public services, essential services? How do you get back to where you were before, or maybe even to somewhere better? And then overall, how do you thrive in an environment? If you live in a risky place, how are you able to thrive? And I think that's kind of the perspective from the individual. Of course, with that comes all of the surrounding infrastructure, not just physical, but I also mean the social infrastructure that enables that. So it's the role of the government, of course, in providing public services, but it's also social networks. And I don't mean the ones on the internet, but your actual networks that help and support you. And also, I think firms play an important role in providing services, providing jobs, making sure that people can maintain an income while they're being hit and can go back to their jobs afterwards and so on. So Just wanted to add that perspective as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So with another aspect that I've always wonder is that in my imagination, when you want to protect yourself more from floods, all you do is basically you raise the levees, and you try to make simply a way in which you can avoid floods getting into houses and to destroy lives and livelihood. That doesn't seem to be a sustainable way forward, right? So it's more a question not just of protection, but also adapting our infrastructure to potential floods. So and I would say that seems almost it's common sense. It makes complete sense to do that, particularly with intensifying events. So. But how do you see these in different parts of the world? I mean, particularly, I'm thinking, Rebecca, you work primarily in the United States. June, you've done a lot of work on low and middle income countries. To what extent are these two things coexisting and still coexisting? And to what extent, maybe rather than protection and adaptation, we also should consider avoidance in the first place, to just plan things so that we minimize completely the risk of impact of floods. I'm not sure whether maybe Jung, you want to start this, considering your work.
Sure, yeah, I can start. Very complex, broad question. Many issues there, I think. I think on the question, maybe you mentioned avoidance. So it's a little bit what I was trying to get at with my presentation, is that we are not really very good at adaptation, or if we are continuing to increase our exposure. So we are settling in flood zones, that's increasing our exposure. So it would be most cost effective to avoid settling in these places in the first place. Because once you've built there, once you have a city in a floodplain, it's almost impossible to reverse that process. I think avoidance really is important when it comes to cases where you have a lack of information, and settling in risky places is happening unknowingly. And that's definitely many of the countries where we work in, that's what's happening. The risk is simply not well understood, or it's not properly integrated into, say, the decision-making for infrastructure investment project. So that's definitely something that can and should be avoided. But sometimes settling in risky places is a rational choice. So I'm thinking of fishery communities that decide to settle on the coast, even though there is a known risk of cyclones and coastal flooding. There is that economic opportunity that comes with being in that place. So households in the end make a decision between trading off risk and opportunity. And that's the case for the fishery community on the coast, but also for the new arrival in a city, low-income household in search for a job in a city. The only affordable place to live tends to be the informal settlement in the flood basin in the middle of the city, for instance. Everything else in the periphery is too far to access jobs. So again, there's that rational trade-off between risk and opportunity. But I think I only answered a quarter of your question. Maybe I'll leave the rest to my panelist colleagues.
Yes, please. Rebecca, Paul, please say what you think. And then we can...
Just following on Jun's comments, I think of kind of two different elements. And I think that thinking about the kind of parallels and differences in terms of kind of the social elements in the United States versus in low and middle income countries is really interesting. And I think there's a lot of parallels and also lots of differences. But one thing that strikes me is that as we think about adaptation, a lot of it is kind of thinking about the actual people that are living in these places and what kind of barriers they're facing in terms of resilience. So how do we facilitate kind of the resilience of those individual people and those communities? I think that ends up being really important. And then the other element of course is thinking about adapting the physical kind of infrastructure of a system. In the United States, I think it's relatively straightforward. I think people are making good progress in terms of developing in ways, as you showed, Jun, that in developing more in upland areas that are lower risk, and we're doing a reasonable job, I think, of integrating stormwater management and flood management into new developments. I think the challenge comes with older cities that have already been developed that might be space limited in terms of creating more green space or kind of more natural solutions to adapt to this. And so there, the challenge becomes adapting that infrastructure, and that's really expensive. That ends up being like the main hurdle there, is that you have this huge expense to replace aging infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure, people don't even know where it is. I'm sure this is also a problem in Europe. And so there, that is really the big challenge there, is adapting these infrastructure systems. A lot of them are designed for really small flood events. Even when they're kind of scaled up, they're still quite small. So in DC, there was just a big tunnel project to reduce confined sewer overflows into the Anacostia River. They upgraded the system from a 2 to 5 year event to a 15-year event, which of course is going to be increasing in frequency as we move into time. So those are some of the challenges, I think, with adaptation. It's thinking about that physical infrastructure as well as the social infrastructure.
I'd agree with that. So everywhere we've looked, where we've done comparative studies of the impact of climate and socioeconomic change on future flood risk, everywhere we've looked, it's always been the case that socioeconomic drivers are much more important in terms of change in flooding into the future than climate. The study we did with Daniel Swain of UCLA over the US showed it was about a 4-to-1 ratio in favor of socioeconomic changes rather than climate changes. And what we see from the work I showed earlier is that actually if we control emissions, the increase due to climate can be kept down to pretty manageable levels, kind of levels that we should be able to engineer our way around. But it's the avoidance of risk. That's assuming 2020 population out into the future. If we build in reasonable projections of population growth and where those people will settle, then actually that's a much bigger driver than climate under most scenarios. So that comes back to Yun's point about not compounding the problem that we already face. The more we control emissions, the more of future flood risk is already with us in the present day. So if flood risk is only going to increase 10%, then axiomatically it follows that 90% of it is already with us. So dealing with the future is a question of dealing better with the present. We're not terribly well adapted to the now, if you want to put it like that. And becoming better adapted to now will confer quite a lot of the protection that we need going forward if we manage to control emissions. So, which is all a long way of saying that Jun was right, and it's building in risky zones that is important. I think I'd also say that there are limits to adaptation as well. That we can only build levees so high. There are limits to the accuracy of warning systems and evacuation routes. So it isn't the case that we can infinitely adapt or infinitely protect ourselves as well. And it is this legacy development largely that if we control climate emissions, it will be the legacy development that we have to deal with, and that's our best case scenario.
But just to clarify there, Paul, so what you're saying is that even in the case of the worst case scenario in terms of temperature risings, the effects of that will still be relatively, I wouldn't say minor, but they will combine with the risk that already exists, but by simply making things worse. But they are not necessarily the main cause. So you're saying socio-economical aspects are still the main drives.
Yeah, I think we haven't done the study globally. We've only done it in particular countries like the US and the UK. But everywhere we've looked, socioeconomic change has been the larger driver of increases in flood risk in the future. Of course, the more we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the less that becomes true. But I think even under extreme emission scenarios, socioeconomic change is at least as big or bigger than climate change, even under those conditions.
Thank you. I've seen that, by the way, there's some questions coming in and some of them are related. For example, there's a question about migration. To what is the situation in terms of flood-induced migration, for example? Are you, do we have enough data, enough studies to know whether floods actually we build in flood risk areas the risk of floods, so then we have to face the consequences of that. But do we see a substantial migration around the globe that is a consequence of floods, and could that be even seen as an adaptation strategy? I'm not sure it's to ask this too. Anybody can answer if you have an answer.
I can start. I mean, I don't think we've got a comprehensive picture, Fabio. We know that floods lead to displacement of population in particular events. So there's, people are evacuated temporarily, and not all go back. We know as well in places like Bangladesh, it's a driver of rural to urban migration at particular times. And we know in countries like Mozambique that severe flooding affects long-term economic development trajectories. But in terms of a global holistic view of migration impacts or flood impact on displacement, I don't think we've got a good, complete handle on that.
I'm not sure whether Rebecca or John, you want to add anything? You got? I guess that my impression is that mostly the migration. I've always had the impression that migration could be related to climate, is particularly related to droughts as well, to the lack of water. But this is obviously related.
There's been some very nice studies in New Orleans when after Hurricane Katrina about how people who were displaced by the event, many didn't actually return, but they were replaced by other groups moving in. So in terms of the communities in many locations, it was a zero change, but it was different people. But again, these are quite small scale studies of particular events. I don't think we've got a synoptic or systematic view of this.
Well, maybe I would just, I completely agree with that. Maybe I would just add that because you asked about migration as an adaptation measure specifically, and that's definitely also what we've observed in some places where kind of planned relocation is being used as a way to adapt, especially when you have very frequent flooding events. But I think it's a very complex endeavor, very risky, just from a social perspective, because as I mentioned, often when you have communities that have settled in a risky place, that's often for a reason. I mentioned the fishery communities that are on the coastline. They are there for a reason, because they need access to the harbor, to the sea, to their ships, and so on. So if you relocate them inland, then obviously that disconnects them from their main source of income. So how do you manage a relocation program in a way that can sustain, maintain livelihoods, protect the community cohesion, those kinds of social aspects, that needs to be very carefully managed and implemented.
Thank you. Thanks. And I'd like to thank actually whoever asked that question, and also all the other people that are sending their question in. I'm going to move on to a next one, which is also quite an interesting thought. So this is from Ananda Karunaratne. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly, from University of Colombo. So what are your thoughts on the failure of existing flood early warning system in the face of ongoing climate change challenges? For instance, consider the 2021 German mass flooding event, the 2022 Pakistan mass flooding event, 2023 Libyan torrential rains and flooding event. So are the really early warning system failing? And, are they related partly to the fact that, to what you were saying, Paul, and the uncertainty about climate flood modeling, or there's something else there?
Well, I can start and say a few things, but I did that last time, so I'm happy to let my colleagues go ahead of me if you or Rebecca would like to jump in.
I think Rebecca is happy for you to go.
Okay. So I think all those different events that the questioner mentioned, the early warning systems didn't work in particular in different ways. So I don't think there's an obvious glib answer here. In Germany, for example, the warning systems worked well. The event was well forecast. Where the system fell over is in disseminating that forecast through to the people who needed the information and for them to be able to take a decision. So the science end of the system did its job. A forecast was produced, and those events were identified quite a few days out as being problematic. But something happened after that. That's where that particular system broke down, and the warnings didn't get through to the people who needed them. And I know there's a large kind of inquiry, investigation afterwards to find out exactly what went wrong. In terms of Pakistan, I don't know in so much detail, but it's a very big flood event. I suspect it was well forecast because it's a big flood event in the lower reaches of a major river, and it was multiple days of rainfall. So again, I think that was probably well forecast. It's often in the dissemination of these things. And I think we shouldn't discount the fact that forecast systems have improved enormously over the last 5 to 10 years. And we've been doing some work forecasting tropical cyclones in southern Africa for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office here in the UK. And the FCO then distribute those forecasts to their partners on the ground, and they use them to decide where to build air bridges, food dumps, which roads are going to be impassable at the end of the event. And you can see a real benefit of them. But they have to be disseminated and communicated in the right way, in the right ways to the right people. And different groups will need those forecasts disseminating in different ways to make most sense to them.
Thank you, June. Rebecca, did you have anything to add on this particular point?
No.
So there's another question here about building new buildings, and this is from Mark Bellington, and it's so can we imagine, and this is actually quite interesting to think about a futuristic even architecture. So can we imagine really building houses differently? For example, stilts houses that float. Can we imagine even in the long-term future, well, not that long-term, but changing completely the way we build houses and build new developments, and would that help?
Can I start maybe this time? Or Rebecca, do you? So maybe I would take the question and take a step back and think a bit more generally about building standards and safety standards in general, because there's always a trade-off. I mean, again, I'm speaking from the context in which I work with, where often you face financial constraints. So how much stronger can you build a house if you have only X amount of budget available? So there it really comes down to identifying the types of solutions that can be retrofitted on a large existing building stock, and that you can integrate into a effective regulation and kind of oversight systems or safety standards that can be enforced given the local administrative enforcement capacity. So already those may sound fairly straightforward, but are huge challenges in many places. So just being able to say, what kind of flood events should our building stock in this particular city be prepared for? Which neighborhoods do we need to retrofit? Where do we find that financing for? And then who is going to actually visit each building, make sure it's built up to standard, and then ensure that it's maintained over the years. So I think just that those are, I think there's no easy way around it, but it's going to be absolutely crucial for ensuring bringing down the vulnerability of high-risk neighborhoods for that. Over to my colleagues.
Thanks. Rebecca, or Paul, I'm not sure whether you wanted to follow up. I have a follow-up question that is connected, but please, Rebecca, go ahead.
No, I think that's a better answer than I was going to say anyhow. This isn't an area of expertise for me at all. I guess my one thought is that it kind of depends on the type of flooding that you have, which and the type of risks that you have and the types of buildings you're trying to adapt, right? Kind of the setting of what you're doing kind of determines some of the feasibility of doing that, let alone kind of the policy elements of it.
So my follow-up question was about there's a lot of talks about nature-based solution, right? For not just for flood protection or flood adaptation, but even for stormwater and runoff and the consequence of that on water. Where are we with that? Is it something that is feasible? Can we scale it up? Is it too costly? Does it depend on where we are? And again, I think, Rebecca, you mentioned that before. There's infrastructure which is already there. It's been there for a long time. How are we going to replace that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge area of research, and a lot of cities in the United States are investing really heavily. Cities and other governments are investing really heavily in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. These can occur on everything from the tiniest scale, from a single parcel, all the way up to watershed scale, and even coastal projects that can kind of be seen as prevention measures against storm surge. So there's a lot to unpack with these. It's definitely a rapidly evolving field where I think the science is trying to catch up with what's actually being developed. So there's the challenges that I see in this is that for the small scale interventions, getting them to work at scale really requires a lot of individuals to buy into it, and that can be really hard. And again, I'm speaking from like a US perspective here, where getting homeowners to put in rain barrels or rain gardens or something, it's really hard to get adoption of those practices high enough to a place where you're going to actually see a hydrological impact of those types of practices. On a larger scale, though, they can be really effective, and I think in combination across those scales, they can be really effective. I'm seeing a lot of community groups using money from governments to install stormwater management green stormwater management practices at neighborhood scales. So that's kind of a slightly bigger than the parcel scale, but those can be really effective if they're scaling up. The other kind of challenge with them is that they take a lot of space. And so in really dense urban areas, finding the space to put these things in can be hard. But on the plus side of them, they can be cheaper over the lifetime of the project, as well as the initial investment than traditional green infrastructure. They can be really effective at larger scales. When cities go all in on this stuff, it can be really helpful in terms of kind of increasing the capacity of their existing infrastructure. So we see cities like Portland, Oregon, and Philadelphia putting in lots of green, really heavily investing in green infrastructure to reduce water inputs to their combined sewer systems, so that they don't have to mess with the gray infrastructure, but they're reducing the inputs of water to that system so that those systems are able to function even though they're at a lower capacity. And then what some people see as the biggest benefit of these types of things is all the co-benefits. So you're not just dealing with flooding, but you're also creating habitat, creating recreational opportunities, reducing urban heat island effects through having trees and other kind of green spaces. And so there's all these kind of added benefits that you can have from these that can improve the livability of cities.
Thanks, Rebecca. There was another question here that I'd like to expand upon. This is from Ishwar Joshi, and it's about can you imagine combining the data on the water levels with machine learning? And I would say, machine learning. Little anecdote: we get so many proposals at Nature Water about considering machine learning in every type of water application. But and I would say, aside from water levels, of course, that's also it's one specific case. But in general, to what extent is machine learning applied already, or can it be applied to in the field of flooding and flood predictions and for flood resilience? I think you're muted, Paul. Sorry. I try to unmute you, but I cannot. Is June and Rebecca, do you have any thought on that while we're waiting for Paul to? So are you aware of any machine learning type of research, particularly, if you think even from a data on social and economic aspects, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I can only begin to imagine what Paul would respond if you would not be on mute. Flood modeling is immensely complicated, and it's not just about looking at what the particular water level is right now, but you need to take into account so many different factors, from the topography of where you are, the climate, the rainfall probabilities. There's a whole probabilistic aspect to it. So how likely is it, given the current climate conditions, how much rain a particular catchment basin will receive, and what that will mean in terms of the runoff further down. So of course, these new tools, statistical analysis tools, including machine learning, are important for doing that. But I think it's, I hope Paul can come in on that, but it's definitely a lot more than that.
Yeah, sorry about that. For some reason, my system froze. I had to go out and come back in again. Well, I think Yun probably did a pretty good job of covering for me and saying exactly what I would have said. We use machine learning a lot to prepare the data sets for the hydrodynamic modeling we do, but I think there's limited scope for it to use machine learning to replace dynamical models. Flood inundation is such a non-linear problem. We often want to simulate floods that have not happened in the observed record, or are bigger than anything that we've seen in the present day climate. And if a particular flood defense is overtopped, you get a massive extension of the flood extent, which is, machine learning models are very good at interpolating, but they can be less good at extrapolating out of sample. So I think there's some good reasons why we'll still always need dynamical models. And go back to the question, can we use machine learning on the water levels? The thing that follows from that is, where are you going to get your water levels from? Because the gauging stations are a long way apart. Current satellite data pre the SWAT satellite mission probably can't do that. So you end up that you have to take your water levels from numerical models anyway. And so if you need dynamical models to drive your machine learning or AI systems, then it's the dynamical model that's the ultimate arbiter or the ultimate predictor.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm noticing the time, so I'll give the word back to Herb in just a minute. I'm going to do what many people do in panel discussion. I'm going to put you on the spot and just ask you to give me just one last thought each about what do you think we should do? What is the first thing you think we should do to find solution for water for flood resilience? I'm telling you just 1 minute, and this is obviously what we've been talking for an hour, and we could talk about for another week. But so let's rephrase it. Can you just give a final thought on this topic, and just before we say goodbye? And I'll start again with Paul, just so you were finishing talking.
Thank you, Fabio. I mean, I've got 2 points. Don't make the problem worse. Keep control of emissions. And add a third, try and make the stuff you've got that's in harm's way more resilient. Thanks.
Rebecca?
I think one big take home is it needs to be collaborative. This needs to be done in partnership with communities, with businesses, with governments, and everyone needs to be working together.
Thanks. Finally, Jun.
Maybe Paul took my line, but I would definitely say, do not make the problem worse before before we can improve the situation. You need to stop making it worse. But to do that, I think you really need to work through the complex drivers that are resulting in that risky situation that we see now. And that means looking at the institutional factors, the economics, the social dimensions, also the physical infrastructure aspects. All of that you need to consider. So I'm afraid there's no simple solution, but it is all possible nonetheless.
Thank you. And I'll give the word to Herb in just a second. Just before that, I'd just like to thank you again, Paul. Thank you, June. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, everybody, also for the questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all. And I'd like to say goodbye to all. And the word is back to you, Herb.
Thanks, Fabio. That brings us to the end of our webcast. I think I learned a lot. I hope all of you who are watching also were equally enlightened as I was. Just to let you know that a recording of this conversation, this webcast, will be posted on nature.com soon. And everyone who has registered for this webcast will be sent a link that will take you to that webcast recording, as well as to the Nature Outlook on Water, which will be posted next week. So you'll be able to read about many other aspects of water and the science behind it, in addition to flooding. So thanks to all the panelists for this fascinating conversation. Thanks to Fabio Pulizzi of Nature Water for moderating. Did an outstanding job, all of you. And thanks once again to the Future Investment Initiative Institute, whose funding has made this webcast and the Nature Outlook on Water. Any second now, a poll is going to pop up on your screen, and we'd really appreciate it if you responded, because this really helps us to evaluate and improve our future events. Thanks to all of you for listening and for your stimulating questions, which we got to as many as we could, and I hope everyone was, as I say, as well informed by this discussion as I was. Okay, thanks very much, and goodbye.